These tales are inspired by a real legend from the haunted village of Bretforton, deep in the Cotswolds. Though the details have faded with time, something of it still lingers. Our first tale from Bretforton takes place at the Fleece Inn, a medieval pub steeped in history, soaked in legend and warmed by firelight, though not always by welcome company. This is the story of betrayal, footsteps, and a single wet footprint. The betrayal at the Fleece Inn. It was on a storm-blackened evening that the traveller came into Bretforton. The road from Evesham had become little more than a sluice of mud and puddles, and the wind whipped around the hedgerows like a warning. The man's coat was soaked through, his boots filled with cold water, and his patience worn thin. But there, ahead, just beyond the crooked signpost, was the promise of warmth. A flickering amber glow from crooked windows beneath a sagging thatch. He squinted through the downpour. The Fleece Inn. The building was older than it had any right to be, timber-framed, with walls that leaned inwards, and doorways barely tall enough to pass through upright. The place looked as if it had exhaled history with every winter wind. He pushed open the door and was met with instant warmth. The glow of firelight, the murmur of locals at the bar, and the comforting scent of hops, smoke, and something roasting gently in the back kitchen. The landlord, a man with wiry arms and grey at his temples, nodded a welcome. "Evening. You'll be wanting a bed, I reckon? I'll pay whatever it costs. As long as there's a fire, you're in luck." Room upstairs, fires lit, beds dry, mostly. He slid over a tarnished brass key. "Second door on the left. Mind your head, the beams have caught better men." The room was plain, wooden floor, narrow bed, low eaves that made the ceiling feel like it might press down in the night. A fire danced in the hearth, and the window gave a fine view of the wind-blown village green. He hung his coat near the flames and sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, the storm deepened. Thunder rolled somewhere far off, but inside, it was still. Until the footsteps started. It began softly, like someone pacing above his head. Boots on boards, deliberate, uneven. But this room was at the top of the building. He knew it. There was no floor above, only attic and beams and old roof slates. He stood, listened. The steps continued, from one side of the ceiling to the other, then paused, then again. He crossed to the hearth and looked up. The sound was louder now, as if whoever was above was circling. Then, silence. He did not sleep well, and when he woke in the pale morning light, something else caught his attention. Right by the fireplace, on the warped wooden floor, was a single footprint, damp, booted, as if someone had stepped forward out of the firelight and disappeared. He said nothing as he took breakfast. But a week later, curiosity got the better of him. He returned to the inn, not just for warmth this time, but for answers. Late that evening, long after the last drinkers had drifted away, the traveller approached the bar where the landlord was polishing glasses. "I stayed here last week," he began. The landlord gave a nod of vague recognition. "I think I heard something in the room, upstairs, footsteps above me." "But that can't be, can it?" The landlord slowly lowered the glass. He didn't speak at first. Then, "No, that room's the top, nothing above but roof space." Then who, or what, was walking up there? The landlord hesitated, then poured 2 measures of something dark and strong and passed one over. "Only telling you this because you came back," he said. "Most don't." The story went back to the time of the Civil War, when allegiances shifted with the wind, and villages like Bretforton played host to soldiers of both sides. One such man, a royalist, wounded and on the run, had come to the Fleece. The innkeeper at the time, not this man's kin but long since dead, took pity and gave him shelter. He was hidden in that very room under the roof, tended, fed, but someone betrayed him. They say the Parliament men came in the night, dragged him out, hanged him from the old tree at the edge of the green, didn't even wait for sunrise. The traveller frowned. The innkeeper gave him up. The landlord gave a slow nod, and 2 weeks later that same innkeeper was found dead. No sign of struggle, no blood, just gone, cold. And on the floor beside him, a single wet footprint. The traveller returned to the room that night. He told himself it was nonsense, a fireside tale, something to frighten drunkards. But as the hours deepened and the fire dimmed, the room changed. The shadows felt heavier. The ceiling creaked. And then the sound returned. Step, pause, step, drag. Above him, where no man should walk, someone moved. He held his breath. The sound stopped. Then, softly, a breath near his ear, not from above, from the room. He spun round. Empty. But on the floor, beside the hearth, glistened a fresh mark, a footprint. He left at dawn, face pale, boots barely tied, but as he passed through the tap room, he stopped and looked back at the landlord. "One more thing," he said. "Do you remember the name of the innkeeper?" The landlord raised an eyebrow. "No record of him, but locals always said he had a name like yours." The traveller didn't smile, just turned and stepped into the rising mist. The Fleece Inn still stands in Bretforton. The upper room is no longer let to guests. But if the night is wet and the wind is high, some say you can hear a bootstep crossing the rafters, looking for the man who turned him in. This is the story of the witch tree of Bretforton. There are villages in England that history seems to forget, not because they were unimportant, but because they preferred it that way. Bretforton is one of them. Set on the edge of the Vale of Evesham, surrounded by stubborn hedgerows and weather-worn orchards, Bretforton sits quiet. The kind of quiet that has roots, the kind that keeps its stories close. And in Bretforton, they still do not speak of the tree. But there was a time, long ago, when the whole village gathered beneath it. It was in the years after the first Great Plague. Whether it was the return of pestilence or another sickness entirely, no one could say. The dates were not recorded. But the memory lingered. The death came quickly, a cough in the morning, cold skin by night. At first, they thought it was something ordinary, too much ale, a bad turn in the weather. But the bodies began to stack too quickly. The priest could not keep up with the funerals. The bell of St. Leonard's tolled too often. Children stopped asking questions, and no one dared knock on a neighbor's door after dark. But one door never closed and never caught the sickness. Magda lived in a crooked cottage beyond Holloway Wood. She was old, older than anyone alive could remember. Her house was made of leaning stone and creeping ivy. Her garden overflowed with herbs and roots and things that didn't have names. The villagers had many names for her. Wise woman, midwife, healer, witch. She answered to none of them. She lived alone with a black dog that never barked. It sat beside her like a shadow, always at her heel, and though her hair was silver, her hands never trembled. Her eyes were bright, too bright, some said. She gave tinctures to those who asked. Her cures often worked. She never asked for payment in coin, but asked for strange things instead. A ribbon worn 3 days, a thimble of water from under the bed, a whisper spoken over rosemary. "For the charm to hold," she would say, in a voice like the wind through dry leaves. When the sickness came again, it came quickly. And it spared her entirely. While children burned with fever and men died in their sleep, Magda's chimney smoked cheerily every morning. Her dog stood watch, and the herbs in her garden grew greener than ever. People began to talk. Not loudly, not at first, but the kind of whispering that spreads like frost. "She's untouched," said one. "She knew it was coming," said another. "She fed it," said a third. And then Thomas Fletcher, the reeve of the village, lost his wife and son in the space of 4 days. He said nothing at the funeral, but that night he gathered 3 men and went to Magda's cottage with rope and silence. The next morning, the tree was changed. It was an old wych elm that stood near the church green, tall and twisted, with branches like arms. The village used to hold fairs beneath it, not anymore. Magda was gone. Her cottage, when searched, was empty. A pot still boiled over the fire. Her dog was never seen again. But in the early light, the rope still hung from the elm, and on the branch, the bark had cracked open like a mouth. They say she cursed them with her last breath. No one remembers the words, only that it was not a scream. It was laughter. That autumn, the leaves refused to fall. They turned brown, yes, but clung to the branches like dead hands. The wind passed them by. Children stopped playing on the green. Thomas Fletcher's crops failed. His horse broke its leg in the paddock. His barn collapsed in the night for no reason at all. Then he vanished. They found his boots by the mill pond, but not his body. Another man, one of the 3 who walked with him, claimed to see the black dog again, standing beneath the elm, watching. He left the village a week later and never returned. Seasons passed and Bretforton grew quieter. The priest refused to bless the green. The fairs moved to nearby fields. A new tree was planted for May Day dances, and the wych elm remained. The rope still hung there, though no one touched it. It blackened with rain, stiffened with frost, but did not rot. Then, one spring, a stranger arrived. He was a scholar from Oxford, thin and pale, with boots too clean for the lanes. His name was Mr. Percival Hartwell. He stayed at the Fleece Inn and asked odd questions. He was writing a book, he said, something about surviving folklore, superstition in rural England. He had a notebook, a magnifying lens, and an air of polite arrogance. The villagers were kind at first, but as soon as he asked about the tree, doors began to close. Faces turned away. Only old Martha Elsmore, who remembered the tale second-hand from her grandmother, agreed to speak. "It weren't just the hanging," she said. "It were what came after." "What came after?" Hartwell asked, his pencil twitching. "No bird nests in it," she whispered. "Not since that night. And sometimes it sings." Hartwell laughed gently, thinking it a poetic exaggeration. He visited the green that evening. The tree stood alone, larger than he expected, its bark warped and ridged like twisted ribs. No other plants grew near it. The grass was sparse. The air was still. In the fork of one high branch, the rope remained, black, frayed, but intact. He made notes, sketched, tapped the bark. It felt warm to the touch despite the spring chill. Something rustled above him. He turned quickly, but nothing moved. He left before sunset. Something in the light bothered him. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "Curious specimen, wych elm, possibly centuries old. Reports of folk avoidance typical for post-trauma sites. Rope still intact, no rational explanation for preservation. Locals unwilling to discuss. One suggests auditory phenomena. Investigate further." He planned to return in the morning to collect a cutting. He never did. The innkeeper knocked on his door after breakfast. No answer. When they broke in, the bed was undisturbed. His coat hung on the peg. His satchel lay open. The window was unlatched. His notebook remained open on the desk. The final line read, "She said not to cut her down." A search party was raised. They combed the fields, searched the wood, called down the wells. Nothing. One boy, curious and disobedient, slipped out at dusk to look at the tree. He came back white-faced and shaking. He said he saw a man hanging there, pale coat, still boots, swaying slightly in a wind that wasn't blowing. He said the man looked down at him and smiled. The tree was never touched. Another plague came and went. The wars rolled through. Electricity came, then telephones, then the internet. But the tree remained. Locals still crossed the road to avoid walking beneath it. Children are told to stay near the inn after dark, and though most of them laugh at the tale, none of them test it. And sometimes, just before dawn, when the air is still and the world is holding its breath, if you listen beneath the branches, very, very closely, you might hear it. Not a voice, not words, just a soft, low humming, like a lullaby with no end. This tale was inspired by a real legend from Bretforton. Whether the witch tree still grows is for you to decide. Our third tale from Bretforton takes us out of the warm taproom and onto the long, narrow lanes that thread between the fields. It is said that just beyond the edge of the village, where the old Offingham road meets the woods, something walks at dusk. Draped in grey, barefoot on gravel. This is the story of the Grey Monk of Offingham Road. They told him not to take the road at dusk. The warning came not in the form of shouted words or frantic gestures, but in the quiet way the old farmhand looked out the window, as if calculating the remaining daylight. "You'd best be through Offingham Lane before the sky goes," he said, not looking up from his tea. "Wouldn't want to walk that road after the birds stop singing." The visitor, Mr. Hale, a schoolmaster from Chipping Campden, laughed lightly. "Superstition?" But the farmhand didn't smile. "No one who walks it twice says so." Mr. Hale had come to Bretforton to seek quiet, a half-term retreat. The village offered just the sort of stillness he liked. Old houses with heavy doors, a church tower that tolled by hand, and no one in any hurry to speak unless spoken to. He had taken lodgings at a small cottage on the edge of town and passed the first 2 days in peace. Long walks, notes in a leather-bound journal, and the occasional pint at the Fleece. It was on the third evening, with rain clouds gathering and the sun slipping behind the fields, that he decided to walk Offingham Road. He'd heard of it twice, once from the farmhand, and again from the postmistress who refused to say its name without crossing herself. That alone was reason enough to see it. Offingham Road was not much of a road at all, more a track, gravel and hard-packed earth, lined with drooping trees and the slow encroachment of hedgerow. It stretched straight for a mile or so before bending into woodland. Hale walked it with his coat buttoned and his boots snapping twigs as he went. The air was still. The fields on either side lay dark and empty. But the road was odd. It had the sense of being walked recently, yet no footprints marked the gravel. There were indentations, as if something weightless had passed, disturbing the stones without breaking them. The silence was pressing. Even the birds had quieted. Halfway along, the path dipped by a crumbling wall, moss-covered, with a rusted iron gate half hanging from its hinges. Beyond it, tangled trees sloped toward a sunken clearing. A stone stood there, half buried, carved with what looked like the base of a cross. Hale stepped closer, and then he saw the figure. Not approaching, not dramatic, simply standing. At the far end of the lane, by the bend, half shrouded by trees, a man in a long, tattered robe the color of dust and ashes. His head was lowered, hooded, arms tucked inside the sleeves. A monk. Hale froze. His first instinct was to call out, ask if the man was lost or in need, but something in the posture gave him pause. The stillness was unnatural, not restful, but rigid. The man didn't move, didn't sway, didn't so much as blink in the breeze. And then, he did move. He turned, slowly, and took one step forward. Hale backed away, hand gripping the old wall. The monk stepped again. Each footfall made no sound, but the gravel shifted beneath him, a faint scrape like bone on stone. He passed beneath a tree. The branches didn't stir. His feet, bare, Hale now saw, left no print. Only dampness, like the sheen of morning dew. Another step, then another. But the eyes, they were wrong. Where Hale expected shadow or weary sadness, there was only a pale, glassy absence. Not blind, just void. The monk raised one arm, the sleeve hung loose, and pointed. To Hale. He ran, back down the lane, boots hammering the path, lungs burning. The air felt thick, not winded, but smothered. His heart beat wild, chest tight. He didn't look back. Only when he burst from the lane into the first stretch of Bretforton proper, where a dog barked and a child's voice called across a garden, did he slow. He turned. The road behind him was empty. That night, Hale sat in the taproom of the Fleece with his hand wrapped round a brandy glass. The fire crackled. The voices of the regulars were a dull hum. The landlord came over, wiped his hands on a towel. You look like you've seen something. Hale met his eyes. Offingham Road. The landlord's mouth tightened. You saw him? Hale didn't speak. I've heard it before, the landlord continued. People see him when the light goes. Always the same. Grey robe, barefoot, silent as dust. Never speaks, just appears, follows, sometimes points. Who is he? Don't know, but some say, long time ago, a monastery stood down that way. Nothing left now but a few stones and a curse. They say a monk was buried alive there, punishment for a sin he never confessed. Buried alive? Supposedly refused to reveal something to his brothers, some secret. Took it to the grave, or didn't. That night, Hale did not sleep. He lay in the small rented room, candles extinguished, listening, and at some hour between midnight and dawn, he heard footsteps on the gravel path outside. Soft, dragging, not hurried, not lost, just moving, steadily past the window. He did not rise to look. But in the morning, at the edge of his doorstep, he found a smear of damp gravel and 2 pale footprints. He left Bretforton the next day. The village was quiet, the lane overgrown. But years later, in the margin of a school book passed down from a pupil, was found a short note scribbled in pencil. Offingham Road. Never again. Eyes like mirrors, voice like stone. The bend in Offingham Road is still there. The gate still rusts. And some evenings, when the sun falls flat and the birds go quiet, a barefoot figure in grey may be seen at the far end of the lane, pointing toward those who do not yet know they are guilty. At the far end of Bretforton stands a grand house set behind iron gates and overgrown hedges. Its windows are shuttered now. The roof sags and ivy curls along the eaves. But beyond the manor's crumbling face lies a garden, one you'll not find on any map. This is the story of secrets, solitude, and soil that does not rest. The walled garden of Bretforton Manor. It was said that the garden never grew right. Even in summer, when the rest of the Cotswolds bloomed with roses and lavender, the patch behind Bretforton Manor stayed pale and choked, overrun with yellowing vines and brittle stems that never flowered. Children whispered stories of dead soil and buried bones, of strange figures glimpsed between the gaps in the brickwork, of a voice, low, urgent, heard just beyond the ivy-covered walls saying, "Don't go in," but to most, it was just a garden. An old one, walled in, fenced off, and forgotten. Until Mr. Ashcroft came to stay. Ashcroft was not a local man. He'd inherited the house from a cousin he'd never met, a distant relative, one of those sudden windfalls that arrive with too much paperwork and the vague smell of old money. He was a painter, quiet, well-read, looking, as he put it, to find stillness. And he found it, in spades. The manor was large, drafty, and filled with the detritus of generations. Paintings hung crooked on the walls, dust curled around porcelain figurines. The upstairs bedroom smelled of mothballs and dried rose petals, but it was the garden that caught his attention. He first noticed it from the study window, a circular patch of lawn hemmed in by tall brick walls, with a single iron gate set into the far side. The trees around it grew thick, pressing inwards, as if trying to claim the garden for themselves. No flowers, no benches, just an old sundial in the center, and earth that looked heavy. He asked the housekeeper about it, a local woman named Mrs. Kettle. She pressed her lips together. "Best leave it, sir." "Why?" She wiped her hands on her apron. "Things don't stay buried there." Ashcroft assumed it was nonsense, local superstition, village gossip, but he couldn't stop looking at it. The way the shadows fell in odd directions, the way the birds seemed to avoid flying over, the way the gate, though rusted, was never locked. On the 5th day he went in, the garden was colder than the rest of the grounds. There was no breeze, but the leaves in the corners shivered. No birdsong, only the soft crackle of weeds underfoot. The sundial was engraved with Latin too worn to read. The earth smelled sour. Still, Ashcroft was a painter. He saw the aesthetic in decay. He set up an easel, made sketches, shadows against the wall, the shapes of trees pressing from the other side. And then he began to paint. The first work was subtle, a study of shade and form, but when he showed it to Mrs. Kettle, she turned pale. "You've put something in it," she whispered. He frowned. "It's just the garden." "No, sir, look here." She pointed to the background, the dark edge where the ivy hung heaviest. There, half obscured, was a shape, long, thin, robed. A man? "I didn't paint that." That night he dreamed of the garden. He stood at its center, alone. As the wind rose, the sundial turned backwards, the walls pressed in. And a voice, low, ragged, whispered, "Dig." He woke with his hands clenched, fingernails full of soil. He didn't tell Mrs. Kettle, but he returned to the garden in daylight. He brought a spade. He dug. The first layer was dry, brittle roots and stones, then older soil, heavier, deeper still. Something strange. Patches of scorched earth, as if fire had burned deep into the ground, and then he found the bones. Small at first, a fingertip, brittle and yellow, then larger, a rib cage. A jawbone, teeth still fixed, and lower still, a rusted chain. The remains of shackles, the links fused with time and rust. He dropped the spade, backed away. That night, the manor creaked. Ashcroft sat in the study, staring at the half-finished canvas. The figure in the ivy was clearer now, defined, watching. And then the lights flickered, a coldness behind him. In the reflection of the window, he saw a figure, tall, robed, standing in the doorway. But when he turned, the room was empty. Mrs. Kettle found him in the morning, still at the desk, pale and trembling. He said nothing, just pointed to the garden. She knew, of course. The story was old. The walled garden had once been a punishment ground, a place where the Manor's cruelest ancestor, Sir Edmund Dorrington, had held his private court. Servants were tried for petty offences, theft, disobedience, insolence, and buried where they fell, sometimes alive. One servant, a young gardener, had been accused of poisoning the roses, a ridiculous claim born of paranoia. He was taken to the garden, chained, and left to die beneath the sundial. They say he cursed the ground with his last breath, and from that day on, nothing would grow there. Ashcroft didn't paint again, but he stayed in the house. He kept the doors locked, the curtains drawn, and sometimes, late at night, Mrs. Kettle would hear him pacing the garden. One morning, she found the easel standing alone at the center of the lawn. On the canvas, a single image. A man digging, a shadow behind him, and eyes in the ivy. Ashcroft was never seen again. The walled garden still stands behind Bretforton Manor. The gate is overgrown now, the sundial cracked, but the ground still shifts from time to time, and if you listen on a windless night, you might just hear a whisper behind the ivy. In every village, there are places left untouched. Corners of graveyards, shuttered windows in the church tower, doors that creak open but are never seen to close. Bretforton is no exception, and beneath the quiet hymnals and candle wax lies a story rarely told aloud. This is the tale of silence broken, and voices that should never return, the choir of the dead. It started with a note, a single tone, low and drawn, that came floating down from the tower of St. Leonard's Church just after evensong. There was no one in the bell loft, no winds to move the ropes. Yet still, the sound had rung out, drifting across the village like the hum of a bowed string. Mr. Elbury was the first to hear it. He was a retired organist, now in his 70s, with stiff fingers and poor sleep. He lived alone in the shadow of the church and had once played its keys in better times. His hearing was not what it used to be, but this sound cut through the walls like a tuning fork to the soul. He stood at his window, slippers pressed into the carpet, and listened as the note rose again, this time layered. First a baritone, then a second voice, faint and high, then a third, a harmony. The next morning the vicar dismissed it. Acoustics, he said. Birdsong. A trick of the trees. But Elbury shook his head. It was a choir, he said, a trained one. That evening it returned, just after the last light bled from the sky, faint voices rising from the tower, echoing without source, harmonies that didn't belong to any living choir in Bretforton. No words, just tone, perfect ancient tone. By the third day others heard it too. Mrs. Partridge, who arranged the altar flowers, said she paused in the nave and swore she heard plain chants, like a mass, she whispered, but in Latin. I didn't recognize. A postman claimed he saw candlelight through the stained glass windows after midnight. Two schoolboys, dares in hand, swore they saw movement in the choir stalls, long robes, bowed heads. But when the verger unlocked the church the next morning, nothing was disturbed. Dust lay thick on the hymnals, the candles untouched, and the ancient wooden screen, carved with angels and vines, had a strange, fresh scratch along its base. The vicar, Reverend Cole, grew uneasy. He was a modern man, pragmatic, but the stories were spreading. He began keeping the doors locked after dark. replaced the keys, checked the tower himself. One evening he climbed to the belfry just after dusk, torch in hand. The space was empty, still. Cobwebs in the rafters, but just as he turned to descend, he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, deliberate, measured. He spun round. No one there, and yet the footsteps had matched his own, as if keeping time. That Sunday something changed. Evensong began as usual, a handful of villagers in the pews, the smell of damp stone and candle wax rising through the air. But as the organ swelled and the choir sang the first verse, a second harmony rose behind them, fainter, distant, but unmistakably real. Voices from somewhere else. From beyond the vestry, or perhaps beneath the floor. The choir faltered, one boy dropped his sheet music, the organist froze mid-chord. But still, the phantom harmony continued. Full, perfect, and then it stopped. Just before the final amen. After the service, no one spoke. Reverend Cole locked the doors himself and walked home in silence. The next morning, the choir director resigned. "I won't rehearse with ghosts," she said, "and those aren't echoes." Mr. Elbury returned to the church that afternoon. He took the side entrance, the old door with the iron hinge, and walked to the choir stalls. The same seats he'd known as a boy, now warped with time. He sat and he listened. At first, nothing. But then, from deep within the stone, came a murmur. Not quite a voice, more a breath, a hush that gathered like smoke behind the altar. He turned toward it and saw movement behind the chancel's screen. Robe, hood, a figure kneeling. He called out, no answer. He stepped forward, and the figure rose. It was not made of flesh. It shimmered like mist, with no eyes beneath the cowl, no feet upon the stone. Its hands were clasped, not in prayer, but in silence. The mouth moved, no words came. Elbury backed away, and then came the sound, a single pure note, vibrating through the pews and into his bones. He ran. Later, Reverend Cole found him at home, pale and shaking. He made tea, sat with him, listened, and then Elbury told him the story of 1665. In the days of the plague, Bretforton had been struck harder than many villages. The infected were gathered into a barn at the edge of the fields, quarantined and left to die, but the church had not escaped. In secret, by night, the old choir had continued to meet, refusing to abandon their Sunday hymns. They believed their voices would carry to heaven, even as the rest of the world fell into silence. But one by one, they too sickened, and rather than risk the spread, the vicar of the time made a decision. He sealed the choir into the crypt below the altar, boarded the door, bricked it in, told no one. They died within days, their final notes rising through the cracks in the floor. When Cole heard this, he searched the church records. There was no mention of the bricking, but an entry from the plague year simply read, "Choir disbanded, all gone to God." Another note, in different ink, was scrawled beside it, "Silence must be kept." That night, Reverend Cole returned to the church. He brought a torch and a crowbar. He opened the floor behind the altar. The stone slabs were heavy, but they lifted, revealing an old stair. He descended. The crypt was shallow, musty, with brick walls and a low ceiling. Dust coated everything, and then he saw them. Benches, robes, skulls. Still seated in a semicircle, as if mid-rehearsal, mouths open, hands folded, some still held sheet music, parchment now fused to bone. He felt a rising panic, a cold that gripped his spine, and then all at once the choir looked up. No movement of bodies, just presence, a pressure, an awareness. The song began, not in air, but in the mind, voices layered, ageless, beautiful, and wrong. So very wrong. Cole staggered back, up the stairs, slammed the slab shut, and fled. He locked the church, burned the key, left a note for the bishop, and never returned. They say he moved to the coast, took up gardening. As for the choir, they still sing. Not every night, but sometimes after dusk if you walk past St. Leonard's and stop by the yew tree, you may hear it. A harmony without words, a swelling sound from beneath the stone, and if you do, keep walking, do not stop, and never try to join in. The organ no longer plays in Bretforton, the choir is silent, but somewhere beneath the altar a perfect note still holds, waiting for one more voice. Bretforton is quiet now, but in the Fleece Inn the footsteps still echo. In the garden the soil remembers. Along Offingham Road the monk still walks, and in the church the dead still sing. Some villages forget their ghosts. Bretforton is not one of them.